Okay, it's 9 o'clock Pacific here in Vancouver. Welcome to everyone on the line. I'm Sam Wind. I'm the marketing lead here at CGIS. We're joined today by WaterCare Innovations. A little bit about myself. I'm an environmental scientist who spent 15 years in B2B marketing. You can call me a junior valve nerd at this point. I'm joined by the co-president of CGIS, Braden Waters. He's got a lifetime of valve experience working alongside his father, Ross Waters, who's the founder of CGIS. From WaterCare, we've got Brenton Fusati. He is a CEO at WaterCare Innovations. Brenton is a chemical engineer with an MBA, and he serves in a senior leadership role at WaterCare. He's got extensive experience in the design, optimization, commissioning, and operation of industrial and mining water treatment systems across South Africa and internationally. He's joined by colleagues Yahya Kara. Yahya is a mechanical engineer. He's got experience in electrical termination, pneumatic lifting, and OEM water treatment equipment. And we're also joined by Helgard Gauss, who's the head of business development at WaterCare. Next slide, please. So about CGIS, we believe in a world without valve problems. We also believe that there is no perfect valve, just the right valve for the application. And we're making it our duty to find that right valve for our customers, whether they're end users or EPCs specifying the valves. And we represent best-in-class valve solutions, whether they're isolation valves, control valves, or automation. Next slide, please. Still a little bit about our sister companies. DHB Valves is a sales and service company that we work alongside of in Quebec. It's how we go to market there. DSS Valves International is the sales and marketing arm of DSS Valves. That's a guided shear gate manufacturer out of Niles, Michigan, that CGIS is part owners of. We help set up their international distribution. Flow Control is a sales and service company that we recently acquired in Australia and how we go to market there. Nova Hydromet is what I like to call a group of rocket scientists that are actively perfecting letdown control valves for hydrometallurgy applications, and they're also doing a lot of work in oil and gas. And Custom Gaskets is kind of where it all began. That's the C and the G in CGIS. And that was Ross Waters' father's company that CGIS spun off of. Next slide, please. So we want to keep this as interactive as possible. We welcome you guys to ask questions during the webinar. You can type them in through the Q&A there or the chat box, and I'll interrupt the speakers as needed, or we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Brenton.
Thank you very much, Sam, and good morning to everyone. First of all, to CGIS, Sam and the team, thank you for hosting this webinar. We appreciate the effort that you put in arranging this, and we hope we can bring value to the table. So over the next 30 to 35 minutes, I want to talk about something that has quietly changed underneath our industry, and that great many operations are still managing with the assumption of the late 90s. And that's water. Not water as a utility, not water as a line item buried in site services budget. Water as a thing that increasingly determines whether you can expand, whether you can operate, and in some regions, whether you keep your license. As mentioned, I am Brenton Fusati, and I'm the CEO of our African operations. And let me be upfront about what this session is and isn't. It isn't a product pitch for the first 20-odd minutes. It is an honest look at 5 challenges that show up on almost every site we walk onto. Then, yes, we'll look at some of the solutions we've built to address them. And I'll show you real installations with real numbers. If my diagnosis sounds like your plant, we should talk. If it doesn't, hopefully you leave with a framework worth using. So if we look at what we've prepared, we start with the landscape. What's actually shifted? Then the water reality. 5 challenges in order: water scarcity, tailings recovery, clarifier bottlenecks, rising treatment costs, and changes in regulation. Something people avoid discussing: What happens when you don't address these? The risk of inaction. And then the shift in how to think about water, the technologies and a case study. We close with a call to action. What does that mean for the future? So welcome to WaterCare, your comprehensive water treatment solutions provider. Briefly, who are we? WaterCare Innovations started as a South African company with a dream just to solve the mining challenges faced in our local environment. We design, build, and operate water treatment systems throughout Africa. And recently, we've expanded into the US market and now are trying to break into the Canadian market. Our systems is primarily developed for the mining and heavy industry. And we're not a chemical supplier who also sells equipment. We're not an equipment supplier who also sells chemicals. We integrate the whole value chain, from agitation in the dam through degritting, clarification, and dosing of the right chemicals and making sure the water chemistry is fit for the solution provided and developed, to dewatering and waste handling. Our position is not just about water, it's about people. It's about the planet and it's about purpose. That reads like a poster. Here's what it means operationally. When we walk a site, we're not looking for where to sell a clarifier. We're looking at where your water goes, what it costs you at every stage, and where it's constraining you. Sometimes the answer is equipment. Sometimes the answer is that you're dosing chemicals at a problem that is fundamentally hydraulic, and no amount of flocculant will fix that. That's the lens for everything that follows. So if we look at the landscape and the changes that's reshaping our industry, what has actually changed? If we look on the column on the left, what drives scarcity? On the right, what scarcity drives in return? The drivers, climate variability and drought frequency, not averages, variability, which is what it breaks as a water balance designed around an average. Population growth, which arrives on your site not as people, but as competing demand from municipalities and agriculture drawing on the same catchments. And aging infrastructure, which delivers a lower quality raw water for the same volume, so the same intake costs you more to treat. If we look to the right, the consequences, water use restrictions, more stringent environmental regulation, community and stakeholder pressure. Notice that the right-hand column is not a list of things that happen to the environment. It's a list of things that happen to you. Scarcity does not arrive at your gate as a dry riverbed. It arrives as a license condition, a location cut, and a public meeting. The water reality. What are the key water challenges? 5 challenges. Let's take them in order. Water scarcity. Challenge number 1. The mindset problem first. Historically, water was a readily available resource. You budgeted for it the way you budget for compressed air. It was there. The engineering question was how to get it out of your process safely and cheaply. The realization, and for many operations that has been genuinely uncomfortable, it is the water is a finite resource in a specific catchment with a specific allocation contested by specific other users. Demand continues to rise. Supply is less predictable. And here's the line I'd ask you to sit with. Water is not guaranteed. Many mining and industrial sites today operate in water-stressed regions, sites that were not water-stressed when they were commissioned. Nothing changed about the plant. The catchment changed around it. If your water strategy was designed under the old assumption, it is now a liability. And you may not have noticed because this constraint doesn't announce itself. It shows up as a throughput ceiling nobody can explain, or a capital project that keeps getting deferred. Challenge 2, tailings recovery. From mining operations specifically, tailing facilities represent the single largest opportunity for water conservation on site. Not the plant, not the wash bays, the tailings facility. And historically, that isn't how they were thought about. Tailing management was reasonably, given the history, a storage and safety problem. The objective was containment. Water in the tailings was a stability issue to be managed, not an asset to be recovered. That has changed, and it has changed fast. The objective now, maximizing water recovery, reducing freshwater intake, reducing environmental liability, and increasing resilience during drought. Only if you can source it. While managed conventional facilities typically recover 2/3 to 3/4 of their water. Second, and filtered systems recover materially more. Think about what that gap represents. Every cubic meter that leaves with the deposit, entrained, evaporated, seeped, was abstracted, was pumped, was treated, and was paid for. You never recover all of it. Nobody does. But the difference between a facility at the bottom of the recovery band and one near the top is not a rounding error. It is material reduction in freshwater intake, in pumping load, and in your exposure during a drought year. Which is why recovery is becoming a strategic KPI rather than merely a process metric. It's appearing on the same dashboard as recovery grade and units costs. If it isn't on yours yet, I'd suggest that's a matter of time. Now, what are some of the Clarify bottlenecks? Aging infrastructure. Across many industries, clarifiers become hidden constraints. I use hidden deliberately because a clarifier bottleneck almost never presents as a clarifier bottleneck. It presents as something else, and the something else gets treated instead. The causes are usually one of 5. Hydraulic overloading. You're pushing more flow than the settling area supports. Increased solid loading, changing feed characteristics, often because the ore body changed and nobody respecified downstream. Reduction, expansion without treatment upgrades, the classic, and inadequate sludge management, where blanket depth is never properly controlled. The symptoms: reduced throughput, poor water quality, increased chemical consumption, solid carryover, and a compliance risk. And now, the pattern I want to draw out, because it's the most expensive habit in this industry. When operators see poor overflow quality, they increase the chemical dose. It's a rational response. Flocculant dose is the fastest lever available. It's on the panel. It needs no shutdown, no capital request, and it provides a measurable improvement for a short period. But if the underlying issue is hydraulic, if your rise rate has crept above what the settling area supports, then flocculant is not treating the problem. It is masking it. You will spend more on chemicals every year. Your sludge volume will grow. Your disposal cost will grow with it, and the actual constraint will still be there, undiagnosed, capping your throughput. I put it in this way. Many treatment challenges are capacity challenges disguised as water quality problems. We'll come back to that at the end. The fourth challenge, and it compounds the third. Costs are rising from several directions at once. Higher energy prices, rising chemical costs, more stringent discharge standards, meaning more treatment per cubic meter, increased sludge management requirements, aging infrastructure demanding more maintenance for the same performance. That's the interesting part. This is easy. The true cost of water is no longer simply the purchase price. When a site tells me what water costs them, they usually quote an abstraction tariff. That number is real, and it's a fraction of the truth. The actual cost of a cubic meter on your site is abstraction, treatment, plumbing, energy, chemical usage, waste disposal, environmental compliance, plus, and nobody prices this one, the production you lose during shortages. Most organizations underestimate their total water cost, and there is a structural reason. It is distributed across multiple departments and multiple budgets. Energy sits with the electrical engineer. Chemicals sits with metallurgy. Sludge disposal sits with environmental. Abstraction sits with site services. Production losses sit nowhere. They're absorbed as a difficult quarter. No single person on your site sees the total, which means no single person on your site has ever been able to build the business case for fixing it. If you take one action item from this webinar, take this one. Get someone to add all those numbers up. Not for a proposal, just to know. In our experience, the total is a multiple of what people expect. And the moment it's on one page, projects that couldn't be justified for years justify themselves. And the fifth, regulations globally are becoming more demanding. That's neither new nor surprising. What is new is the number of parties you're accountable to. It used to be the regulator. Now it's the regulator, your investors, the community, and increasingly your customers, who have their own reporting commitments and are asking you questions they never asked before. The focus areas are consistent. Discharge quality, water use license, ESG objective, and sustainability reporting. And the consequences are not abstract. Fines, production interruptions, permit restrictions, reputational damage, and community conflict. Compliance has moved from a legal obligation to a strategic objective. It is used to be a hurdle. Clear the bar, get on with production. It is now a determinant of whether you get the next permit, the next expansion, the next investor. And the industry is moving from reactive reporting to proactive accountability. Reporting what happened last quarter is table stakes. What is expected now is demonstrating that you have systems ensuring it won't happen and being able to show the data. Those are your 5: scarcity, tailings recovery, clarify bottlenecks, treatment costs, and compliance. They are not 5 separate problems. They are one problem with 5 symptoms. Which raises the question nobody enjoys. What happens if these challenges are not addressed? So if we look at the production risk, production limitations and unplanned downtime, when clarifiers can't handle peak flows or water shortage forces reduced throughput, equipment fouling and accelerated wear from inadequate degrading and poor solids management, and bottlenecks that prevent capacity expansion without major civil works. That third one is the quaint one. It doesn't cost you production today. It costs you the growth you never attempted. Financial risk. The same story is in currency. Escalating OPEX, fresh water, chemicals, pumping, and treatment energy, sludge disposal, higher CapEx when you expand using conventional large footprint technology, because footprint is civil works, and civil works is where budgets go to die. Lost revenue from reduced output during water-related constraints. Water inefficiency eventually appears somewhere on the balance sheet. The only variables are which line and how long it takes. Environmental risk. Non-compliance means fines, shutdowns, reputational damages, permit challenges, environmental incidents. The requirement for transparency and reporting only increases. And the structural point at the bottom, water risk is increasingly a board-level issue. It is being asked about in board packs, which means the person who owns the answer may no longer be the person who owns the plant. Sustainability risk, investor pressure, ESG expectations, water stewardship requirements. communities and stakeholders far more aware of industrial water use than a decade ago and far better equipped to act on it. Water stewardship directly impacts your license to operate, not metaphorically, literally. So here's the question on the slide, and I'd like you to answer it for yourselves. Is water currently supporting your growth strategy or limiting it? And the last one, where the failure mode is most specific, clarifies that capacity, thickener limitations, tailing handling restrictions. Overloading a system accelerates wear and failure. Deferring an upgrade doesn't avoid the cost. It converts a planned cost into an unplanned one at a moment you don't choose. Run to failure is a legitimate maintenance strategy for some assets. It is a dangerous one for water systems, because when a water system fails, it doesn't fail alone. It takes production with it. And sometimes it takes your discharge permit too. If that's the diagnosis, what's the response? Two things: a shift in the mindset and a set of practical first steps. Neither requires you to buy anything. Shift one, water recovery rather than water disposal. The old mindset asks, how do we remove water from the process? The new one asks, how do we keep water in the process? Same plant, same equipment, and an entirely different set of engineering questions. Once your objective is retention rather than removal, every unit operation gets evaluated differently. Shift two, treatment infrastructure as a production asset. Water systems get classified as utilities. Ancillary equipment, they're maintained accordingly, funded accordingly, specified accordingly. But if your clarifier captures throughput, and on many sites it does, then your clarifier is not a utility. It's a production asset. Reclassify it, and the capital request stops competing with the canteen refurbishment and starts competing on return. Shift three. The traditional question is, how much water can we treat? The better question is, how much throughput can you achieve from the treatment footprint you already have? Footprint is constrained, everything else hides behind. Footprint is why the expansion needs civil works. Footprint is why the capital number is what it is. And footprint is why the project has been deferred 3 years running. Change the performance you get per square meter, and a lot of the downstream problems simply stop existing. So what are the practical steps? Yes, 5 steps. Conduct a focused water audit, not a compliance audit, a mass balance. Where does water enter? Where does it go? Where is it lost? And what does each stage cost? Perform a water risk assessment and opportunity assessment. What is your exposure in a drought year? What is your allocation trajectory? Benchmark against modern capabilities, not against your own history, against what exists today. Most sites are benchmarking a 1998 clarifier against a 1998 clarifier and concluding they're doing fine. Develop a phased implementation plan. Nobody replaces a water circuit in one shot. Sequence it so early wins fund later stages. And build internal capability and partnership. Water expertise is thin on the ground. Decide deliberately what you hold and what you partner for. And notice what is not on this list: equipment selection. Equipment selection is what happens after the audit tells you what the problem actually is. That order matters more than any single technology I'm about to show you. Let's look at modern solutions. Right. With that framing, let's look at what our technology has to offer. The integrated chain. So in our integrated chain, I want to show it before we look at the parts, because the value isn't in any single unit, it's in the integration. 6 functions, 6 pieces of equipment: aeration and agitation, the dam agitation system, grit removal, chemical dosing, and clarification, the high flow degrit plant, and then we have 2 automated chemical dosing plants, one for pH correction and one for flocculant dosing, the high rate clarifier, and then the dewatering and waste removal, the filter press. We present them together because we very rarely find a site where only one of them is the answer. A clarifier fed by ungritted water fails early. A filter press fed by an underperforming clarifier runs badly, and water treatment processes across your site are interconnected. You cannot optimize one and ignore the rest. Here's how it fits together. Dirty feed water enters. It passes through the degritting unit, pulling out the abrasive inorganic fraction, anything above 95 microns in cut size, and discharges it as a dry stackable grit. The degritted stream is chemically dosed, pH corrected, and flocculinated before it enters the high clarifier. Now, our clarifier needs to have the water chemistry corrected prior to entering. So the clarifier acts as a settling vessel, and water chemistry dictates settling performance. So our clarifier can perform up to 132 foot per hour on rise rates, which is roughly 40 meters per hour. And that is dependent on feed water characteristics. Solid load, do we have to precipitate the heavy metals, water chemistry driven factors. Now the overflow typically has a quality of less than 50 parts per million. And the underflow, we try and build up a SG somewhere between 1 to 1.2, so we reduce the cycle times on the filter press. The dewatered filtered cake contains roughly 20% moisture, and that can be handled with a loader, or it can flow through the material handling systems already in place on your operations. So what leaves this diagram? 2 dry stackable streams, grit and a filter cake, moving on the existing mine conveyor system, and process water back to the plant with a water quality of less than 50 ppm. This is illustrative, and it isn't a specific installation, and it isn't to scale. Every system is custom engineered to site-specific conditions. If we look at more detail at each one of these process blocks, the dam agitation system keeps settled solids in suspension within your water storage, maintaining a homogeneous slurry. No sedimentation building on the dam floor. The dam's operational capacity stays what it was designed to be, rather than declining a % a year as solids accumulate. It substantially reduces manual dam cleaning and the need for mucking. This is a safety intervention as much as a process one. So if we look at some of our installations, so the middle rendering, that was our 3D model, and to the left, that is a physical installation completed on site. The high flow degrit plants. So this is the separation of dense abrasive inorganics, sand, silt, gravel from processed water at high flow rates. So we start with the stilling box. We allow multiple sources through the hydraulic separator, which is the first part in the treatment step, where we slow down the particle velocity before we mechanically remove it with the screw. Falls, drop downs onto the floor and can be removed with the front end. Unglamorous, and in our experience, it returns disproportionately to its costs because it's protecting assets worth many times what it costs. So here we're talking about every pump downstream, valve, impeller between your degrit plant and your discharge point that is being eroded by particles you could have removed. Underflow or mud handling becomes simpler because no chance of it choking up your underflow. Then if we look at our automated dosing plants, so this typically would be an automated lime dosing tank where we just want to do pH correction for acid mine drainage water. Water's coming in at a pH of 2 to neutral or slightly higher pH, basic pH, to aid in base metal precipitation, and then our flocculant dosing plant. So this takes a powder flocculant, allows the right hydration time in each one of the chambers. So this is a H240, so this will have 2 hydration chambers, and then the last chamber will be the dosing chamber. This allows proportional control based on flow. And then we move into our centerpiece of our range, our high rate clarifier. Now, the clarifier, as I mentioned, has rise rates up to 40 meters an hour. That is dependent on the feed water chemistry, but in this clarifier, there's no moving parts. We've optimized the active area utilized within the settler to increase these rise rates. And in this, you'll see we have our reactors, and that's where we have increased the active area utilized within the bigger vessel. So this removes your suspended solids, solid liquid separation, conventional clarifiers. We've just reduced the footprint, and it prepares water for downstream treatment, reuse, or discharge. The photo on the left is one of our installations installed underground, which tells you this is a single level installation, no need for multiple level installations, small footprint. This is a 100 liter a second solution, each one of these clarifiers, and there's 2 installed. So this has a treatment capacity of 200 liters a second. Now, we do not have any mudbed dependence. So typically conventional clarifiers have that mudbed dependence, not too low, not too high, where ours, we want to keep that mudbed as low as possible. This is a physical footprint comparison. Now, if we look on the left on a surface installation for a flow rate of 1,800 cubic meters an hour, the typical footprint of a conventional clarifier would be around 300 square meters. For ours, with 5 of our standard HRS 100s, we would only require a 45 square meter footprint. And this is an installation that we've done in 2021. We still operate and maintain it to date. And then on the right, where it had to be an underground installation, where the conventional will be a multiple level installation for 360 cube an hour, 50 square meters required, we only require 9 square meters. So it's about a fifth of the required conventional size. This is just a graphical, footprint on where ours would fit in compared to what is available in the market. So, the standard clarifier going down to the slush blanket, lamellas, and then the sand ballasted clarifiers. And then lastly, our filter press. So from the underflow, we'll go into agitated mud tank. We'll feed that through our filter press, and we'll produce a filter cake of roughly 20%. There's multiple filter presses out in the market. There's nothing special about ours other than integrating within our battery limits. This is the typical cake that we produce from our systems. And then I want to take you through a case study. Now, this was a plant that was, phase 1 was designed and implemented within a 3-month window. It was acid mine drainage that spilled on the back end of an old operating mine. And that caused downstream environmental problems into a nature reserve. And we noticed, some challenges in the nature reserve with animals and what happened there. So the plant was designed initially for 1,800 cubic meters, so 300 liters a second, 400 liters a second. And this is what the aerial view would look like. So this plant was done on a build and operate model. It's where we invest the capital and we operate and maintain it and only invoice our clients on a dollar per cubic meter compliant water produced for environmental discharge. Now, this water contains risk elements, iron, manganese, sulfates, uranium, nickel. Our feed varies somewhere between 2.5 to 3,500 ppm. And in our launder, this water has been pH corrected to 9.5, 9.8. We have flocculated at 1 ppm, and then we produce overflow quality of less than 15 ppm in the overflow. This was phase 1, commissioned in 2016, and in the end of 2025, we added phase 2. So phase 2 added 360 liters of treatment capacity, and the total treatment capacity now sits at around 2,800 cubic meters an hour. It's roughly 65 megaliters a day. This is what the phase 2 installation looked like, and we just added 3 of our modular HRS 120s. So what did this mean? So from a CapEx point of view, if we had to sell this on an outright purchase, that full 65 megaliters a day would cost in the vicinity of 5.6 million Canadian dollars, with an operating cost of just under $1 per cubic meter produced. And that is, chemical supplied, labor for the operation, cloud SCADA integration, and keeping the plant in as-built condition. So the question no longer is if water challenges will affect your operations. It's whether we are prepared. If we look at some of the industry lessons, many treatment challenges are capacity challenges disguised as water quality problems. I said this earlier and I'm saying it again deliberately, because if you diagnose it wrong, you will spend money for years and never fix it. Adding treatment chemicals often addresses symptoms rather than root causes. Chemistry is the fastest lever and the most expensive habit. Water recovery projects can frequently defer major capital projects. Recovering more of the water you already have is usually cheaper than sourcing more, and far cheaper than the infrastructure to bring it in. Small process improvements generate significant cumulative savings. Reduced water intake plus lower reagent consumption, plus reduced pumping costs, improves recovery. No single one justifies a project. Together, they routinely do. A few key takeaways. 1, water is now a strategic operational asset, not a utility, not an overhead. 2, your water treatment processes are interconnected. You cannot optimize the clarifier and ignore the grid. 3, recovery is often more valuable than treatment alone. The cheapest cubic meter is the one you already have. Modern technology enables higher performance with a smaller footprint, 5 times at equal throughput. And I'd underline this one. The best projects begin with understanding your water, not with selecting equipment. We sell equipment, and I'm telling you, don't start there. Start with the audit. If the audit says you don't need us, that is a good outcome, and you'll have spent very little to find out. Let me bring this together. Global water challenges are increasing and becoming more complex. That will not reverse, but they can be addressed proactively, deliberately, and profitably. The future is not treating more water, it's managing water smarter. The industry leaders of the next decade will not be the operations with the greatest access to water. They will be the operations that use what they have most effectively. 6 words: scarcity, recovery, reuse, efficiency, cost control, and compliance. Strategic water management builds operations that are resilient, sustainable, and competitive. So here's what I'd like to offer. We will conduct a focused water assessment on your site. We'll document what we found, what your water actually costs, and where your constraints are. And what you do with it afterwards is entirely your decision. Thank you for your time. A question we can't. Let's see if there's any questions. Sorry, before I continue.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Brenton. That was great. We do have a number of questions that have come in, so I'll hop into that. The first one that came in was, what type of clarifier technology do you use, inclined plate or other? And also, how does this translate to a chemical process such as bitumen froth flotation instead of water treatment?
So in terms to answer the first question, what type of clarifier we use, this is the internal designed and developed WaterCare high rate clarifier. So we've registered a patent on this. So it uses the outside vessel, as you can see, as the larger scale, and then we have reactors on the inside, and that's where our technology sits, where we've optimized collision and angles of these particles to aid in settling of the particles and achieve solid liquid separation.
Perfect. And then, the follow-up was, how does this translate into a chemical process such as bitumen froth flotation instead of water treatment?
Yeah, Ranesh, I don't know if you can maybe come in here and help me out on that one. In terms of flotation, I know you've had some success up in the African side on our clarifier.
If Renee's not on the panelist, they won't be able to speak. We can answer that in a follow-up. We've got the information from the question asker. So I'll move on to the next one.
Thanks.
Yep. What is the difference between your high capacity clarifier and a lamella clarifier?
So the lamella clarifier has the plates on the inside to slow down again the particle velocity, and their rise rates, if I remember correctly, is around 15 meters an hour. So they have plates welded in on the side, and that forces the collisions and the velocity of the particles to be slowed down, right? And with our clarifier, we've increased that effect with the reactors. So we have on one of these, we have about 25 reactors. So each one of them is about 4 liters a second. And in that reactor, we have the same concept, just on an increased frequency of particle collisions.
No, actually, I've unmuted Renee so you can answer the follow-up question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, look, we've never dealt with the bitumen removal froth system. We've never dealt with it before, but we have dealt with oil sands material in a titanium zircon environment. When I just quickly read up on the bitumen froth flotation system there, it seems like there's a you alter the chemistry or the viscosity of the bitumen liquor, and then you're able to settle the solids. I think if we could get more insight into that process, then we would be able to help you. We'll do a little bit of research ourselves, but we've had no experience with the bitumen for now. If I've done it on oil sands, but not, mineral sands, but not on bitumen.
Yeah, perfect. And we can connect everyone through the webinar. Okay, I'm getting some feedback, so I'm just going to mute you there. Okay. Next question is also, how resistant is your clarifier to unpredicted feed changes? Are there detection systems in place to avoid solids breakthrough?
Yeah, so there's two variations there of variability. I assume it's flow variation, and each one of these side launders will open and close based on incoming flow. So we can turn down to 4 liters a second on the 100 liters a second clarifier, and then obviously have the upper limit of 100 liters a second. In terms of solid load, So our turn down on solid load is not low. So we can take up to or go down as low as 100 ppm in the feed solids. And if that's the case, what we do is we reseed underflow into the feed so that we then ensure that we have the particles to collide within our reactors. We can go as high as 40,000 ppm, but going below 100 becomes challenging for us in terms of maintaining overflow compliance. Now, if we have a steady state of 1,000 ppm and we have the solid buildup, we can go down to the 100, and then we just have a reseed, automated reseed that opens up and we ensure that our feed TSS has enough solids to collide. If we go down to the 50 ppm mark, that's when we start struggling.
There was a follow-up comment. He said, I'm not talking about flow variation, more variation in stream composition or chemistry.
So I'm assuming the chemistry change comes from an ore change, if I'm understanding the question correctly, or what your potential cause for the change would be. Again, it would depend on what the system adaptability is. So if we have a pH correction implemented, then the pH loop will just chase that optimal set point in terms of solid settling and flocculant control. So if the pH significantly swings between acidic and basic, then the type of flocculant polymer will have to be altered. But if there's a pH correction step in place, that will ensure that we can handle that variability. And again, it's what do we want to achieve? If it's solid liquid separation, that should be manageable. But if it's environmental compliance and all of a sudden arsenic comes through and we've planned for uranium nickel, the precipitation and Padoe diagrams sit on a different aspect. So ORP levels will need to be understood, pH, and where the optimal precipitation band of that metal sits. Now, seasonal fluctuations, there's enough data and you can understand them and you can plan for them to adjust operationally quite effectively quickly. So it would be, again, a feed water chemistry adjustment, not an equipment selection adjustment.
Okay. We've got a number of questions, so I'm going to keep going. What is the upper range ppm of solids content that the high rate clarifier can take or process?
So, typically we say 40,000 ppm. There's been instances where we've gone as high as 53, 55,000. And it's, again, just what has been available to treat. So if there is opportunity where it does come to 80 or 100,000, we would have to go through that design phase and understand to see if we can still achieve the overflow compliance. Short answer, 40,000 ppm is where we're comfortable.
Good. I've got a question here. Do you have any pulp and paper applications? We have a wet gas scrubber that we are looking at recollecting ash collected prior to flow to the effluent system and or solids removal from the whole effluent stream.
So we don't have one in operation currently, but we are in review to supply one for the pulp and paper industry. Again, we believe we understand solid liquid separation quite well. We don't have an active reference site, but we are working on converting one in the near future.
Great. What types of wastewaters tend to foul the plates in your clarification system?
So the big one would be not really, it's the water chemistry, so high scaling environment. So if we had to have high calcium scale and we didn't plan for it, iron hydroxides, the TCTA video that I showed, the case study, that is iron and manganese hydroxide. So that does scale, the phase 1. At the time, we didn't know about it. Phase 2, we've added a coating and that's limited scaling of our reactors. All it means it is a quarterly clean of the reactors, pulling them. You can do it online, blank off a reactor, pull it out, high pressure wash it, get it back in service.
Okay. Sorry, that was it for questions. There is one more follow-up comment from Robert, who is asking the earlier set of questions. He says, So more of a feed monitoring system and an understanding of how to adjust chemical dosage. Not sure if that resonates right now. We've gone over a number of things.
Yeah, so it's Rob you mentioned, Sam?
Yeah, it's Robert again. Yeah.
Yeah, Robert. So yeah, it's exactly that. Understanding feed water and what chemistry adjustments is needed. And the settler or the clarifier only acts as a vessel for the solid liquid separation. Chemistry needs to be corrected prior to entering the vessel.
Okay, perfect. He says, thanks for that. And that's looking like that's it for questions.